So I'm going to talk about Cisco Supply Chain Digitized, and very much in line with what we heard earlier on in terms of Intel. The market is being disrupted. Consumers are looking at it differently than before, and companies need to disrupt themselves to be able to support this change. And technology is something that's helping us. It's enabling us to be able to make that change. My name is Edwin. Boer. I'm responsible for the supply chain operations in Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Russia at Cisco. I've been at Cisco now nearly close to 20 years and have seen a lot of change across that supply chain. And I think this combination of changing environment and the technology which makes that possible is something which is really something that supply chain experts should take to heart. It gives us huge opportunity. So my goal of this afternoon is just to walk through some use cases, some different concepts that Cisco has applied in its supply chain, and just share that with the results, of course, to see how that might be applicable to your environment or in your companies. Before I do that, who joined the BMW factory tour this morning? Can I see some raised hands here? So I was thinking about this 20 years ago, cars and how they were actually driving across the roads, the sensors that were in those cars compared to the sensors that are in the cars today. The ability to be able to build a self-driving car is really only possible through the technology, the compute power and the sensors that make it possible for us to be able to correct a car with the algorithms and with that data that is coming through out of that car. That wouldn't have been possible 20 years ago. So think about what we can do in a supply chain today, leveraging that same technology, and think about how our supply chain can become so much more than what it is today. So let me run through a little bit of a background, and I won't dwell on this too long. Cisco Supply Chain, a global company, outsourced operations, a number of different countries, a number of different sites. But significant amount of people in that supply chain. We have about 20,000 people in an outsourced contract manufacturing environment, a logistics environment, that every day are doing their work as if they were part of Cisco. Significant amount of components and parts, but in this kind of an outsourced environment, that is something that requires some control, some kind of management, some kind of way in which we can coordinate those activities happening in that supply chain. And digitizing that supply chain is something that is enabling that. Of course, we've got products. Cisco is kind of originally a company that was renowned for being the plumber of the internet, building switches and routers. That's developed over the years, and we now have a very wide portfolio of products in the core of the networks, but also on the boundaries of those networks. So as I kind of highlighted, the need for that digital supply chain is partly driven by the fact that there is a different requirement out there, and partly also because the technology enables that. So we've come through about driving costs improvements, driving lean manufacturing, applying concepts in the supply chain, and over the time, the return of that investment has become less and less. We kind of feel as if we've kind of driven all the optimization and productivity out of a supply chain that's possible. And at some point in time, you need to come to the conclusion, hey, I need to do something completely different. I need to drive that productivity with a step change. We can do that also through the way in which we do that with technology, but it's also because of the market is changing. The way that the companies are buying hardware these days is changing. Instead of just buying a box and getting that box shipped, and then installing it yourself at your enterprise. Sometimes we don't need boxes anymore. We can do it by software. We can do cloud-enabled infrastructure. We can connect ourselves in different ways. And that transition that Cisco is going through from a hardware sales company to much more of a software sales company is something that's driving a change in our supply chain as well. And ultimately, that agility is what we're looking for. How do we adjust and change quicker to what the requirements are within a pretty large and what I would call monolithic company. If I look at how we organize the supply chain, a score model, left-hand side, going through the design, plan, source, make, deliver, and then quality in there as well. That's the way we're organized as a supply chain organization, with, of course, a foundational supply chain transformation organization that helps us to manage through the technology that we can apply in a supply chain. Now, Cisco's end-to-end supply chain has been focused on this digitization journey now for at least 6-7 years. It started off with upgrading and changing our core foundational systems. It then evolved into the ability to be able to connect and use collaboration, IoT functionality, and the ability to be able to do prescriptive analytics. And ultimately, in the fiscal years that we're in now, leveraging that information that's coming out of that supply chain in a way that allows us to orchestrate that, which is another word we heard this morning with Intel. How do you actually leverage that information that's coming out of your supply chain and allow you to make better decisions, faster decisions, and maybe even automated decisions, focusing on exceptions instead of focusing on the rule? So let me now walk through kind of that technology and then some of those use cases that we've applied within our own supply chain. So the technology that we use is the same technology that everybody uses across their supply chain, across their company. Data and analytics. We're getting much more information from everything that we do day to day than what we've ever had before. And the ability to actually kind of analyze that data and drive some important decision making is where we come to data and analytics. The ability to connect and the ability to do that in a real-time environment is something that we're doing across the collaboration space. And collaboration is really around the ability to talk to each other in an outsourced, remote kind of environment where we have to leverage our ecosystem partners for us to be able to actually make the right decisions in our supply chain. Connecting the unconnected, so the Internet of Things or the ability to actually be able to leverage that. I'll walk through a use case as well, but even in a supply chain like today where we have a manufacturing environment, the ability to be able to extract data out of our process equipment and that process equipment to be able to hold those data elements that drive the quality of our product is immensely important for us to be able to understand later on in the process what happened. Why did it happen? What could we have done differently? And the more we move that point forwards, the more it's going to be able to help us to adjust our strategies at the point of manufacturing itself. And then mobility, the ability to be able to use remote access, the ability to use smartphones, or the ability to be able to access your work anywhere, everywhere. So this has resulted in these kind of use cases, and I'll walk through them, but they're all kind of grouped into these different kind of areas. So across that SCORE supply chain, if you think about it from a plan, source, make, and deliver aspect, we have a manufacturing kind of summit here next door where we're focused on manufacturing specifically. But our supply chains are not only manufacturing, it's the logistics, it's the warehousing, it's the planning, it's the distribution, the transportation, the quality. All those different functions within that end-to-end supply chain is something that can leverage that information, can leverage that data to make better and quicker decisions. And better and quicker in those terminologies ultimately relate to cheaper and faster. So let me walk through a couple of these as an example. So 3D printing, for example, being used in a variety of areas. I don't think we do anything special or different than anybody else would do, but we see those benefits in our supply chain. We see where we can actually save money, save time, and be able to drive improvements in our manufacturing process. That could be in spare parts, that could be in areas we can't get to, could be related to volume changes, could be related to new designs. In those areas, 3D printing as an ability to digitize your supply chain and somewhere on the other side of the world, use that specification to deliver a product according to a design somewhere else. Prototype portal. So in our design process, the ability to be able to capture 3D specifications in our supply chain and then be able to connect that to the bill of materials and be able to use that through the life cycle of our product is something that enables us to connect the different areas of our supply chain and the different ecosystem partners of our supply chain. So with a number of companies, whether it be JDMs, ODMs, the way that we build and design our products and the ability to link that into our Agile BOM material concepts. Take, for example, a 3D specification of a part or of a manufacturing mechanical part. The ability to be able to use that during the production process at our supplier, the ability to use that at the outbound quality control at that supplier, but also to be able to use that same at the inbound quality control as we go into the next node of our manufacturing partner. So the ability to use those specifications not only at the design phase, but also through the life cycle of our product helps to be able to deliver those informations to the right places. A supplier collaboration platform, something that is a consequence of an outsourced manufacturing environment, actually a prerequisite to be able to run an outsourced manufacturing environment. With the changes that we're going through with multiple partners in our supply chain, multiple ecosystem partners, and the need for everybody to have a single view of what that demand is, Supply Collaboration Platform is the ability that we've created to be able to connect those different suppliers together in a cloud infrastructure. Using supply and demand as the core concepts, but ultimately also the commits coming back from our supply base, not having to have Cisco be the single source of failure, but having partners be able to connect with each other in that supply chain. The connection of those, you can imagine, one, when you replicate your demand through your supply chain, there's always latency, a weekly EDI signal going out to our suppliers, the ability to then replicate that through to the next tier and the next tier beyond that of that supply chain. There's latency involved in there, and there's, of course, discrepancies. If you think about the available supply and then the mix match between what your EDI signal shows compared to your inventory that you have on hand and the purchase orders you already have. The ability for suppliers to be able to solve supply-demand mismatches themselves, leveraging this connected collaboration platform, is something that's helped us to achieve significant reduction in the number of shortages that we've seen, as well as the speed in which we've been able to recover, and ultimately resulting in a 7% improvement of our lead times. Business award and analytics, when we think about the ability in an outsourced environment to be able to create quotes and have those quotes be able to be compared, those are kind of different areas in our supply chain where all of us would have experience with that you want to go do faster and you want to do it more frequently. An ability to do the component quoting process in a cloud infrastructure and then leverage the data that we're getting back from our suppliers for future quoting processes has helped us to actually achieve better results, cheaper, but ultimately quicker feedback and the ability to run this on a more frequent basis. Energy management, complete different area here, but the ability in our infrastructure to be able to understand what energy consumption is has helped us to significantly reduce the overall cost of energy, primarily in our manufacturing environment. So think about manufacturing processes where test machines consume a significant amount of energy and the ability to be able to streamline that through the information and the algorithms that that energy sensor is being able to deliver. So we've connected in one factory all the machines in that factory that have some energy consumption. We upload that into our cloud infrastructure from a central area. We're able to analyze the energy consumption of each and every machine in that production process and understand through the process of production and the way in which we're actually sequencing our production processes, the downtimes and the cooling times required for the machine, the changeover times of the machines, ultimately within that entire manufacturing environment, being able to understand what you're consuming and what you're paying for compared to what you're getting allows you to be able to make that comparison and be able to drive improvements in that supply chain. Remote export's another example where we're just using collaboration capability and the ability of augmented reality to be able to view and see what's happening at remote sites. Access to experts in a global company with 70,000 people across the globe, but not always the right people in the right region, and the ability to be able to connect that remotely through that capability and technology that we have allows us to use that in areas where we need to. A global manufacturing organization and the fact that we have head offices in San Jose in California, but a significant amount of our manufacturing in Asia is something where we really need to be able to support with the right experts in the right place. Adaptive testing, and this is one of the areas that is being more recent in terms of our ability to connect the process technology with the actual serial number of the product that's coming out at the end of the production line. Think about a manufacturing process of subassembly and assembly, and think about the fact that there's about 2,400 different variables that can be measured during that production process for one unit at a time. And of course, SMT machines, manufacturing machines have the ability to be able to grab that data from their own machines, but that's not always compatible with each other. So the connection and the use case that we've been able to drive is being able to connect one of our most complicated products and use all the data, all 2,400 flows of variables through the process of production, upload that into a cloud infrastructure, analyze that with machine learning, and then be able to drive algorithms that allow us to see when certain process variables are slowly moving in the wrong direction to actually be able to move ahead and change that process immediately. Now, we believe this is a huge opportunity for the future in an environment where you can actually leverage a significant amount of data, because what it's resulted in is the ability for us to be able to reduce a 4-step test process into a 1-step test process. And we've been able to reduce the amount of burn-in chambers that we needed to be able to test our products like we do today. So think about the capital expenditure of your test equipment and the ability to reduce that, but also think about the speed where we have less testing time required than what we originally had. So that drives continuous improvements, but ultimately reduces the cycle time of our production and increases the ability to leverage our investments for other areas. Connected quality at cockpit. When we work with our outsourced manufacturing environments, we need to be able to guarantee that the quality of a product built in Asia is the same quality of product that's built somewhere else in Mexico or in the US. So bringing together that quality data, not only from the manufacturing sites, but also from other parts of our supply chain, is able to connect in what we call a quality cockpit, which then allows us to be able to reduce the amount of, and apply that quality learnings in other areas, reducing the amount of failures that occur during the process. So these are examples where we're actually being able to commit and change some fundamental processes within our supply chain, with being able to leverage the technology that we have today, similar to what we call universal order visibility. And this is another area where in a supply chain, in an outsourced environment, you not only have your own systems to deal with, you have your systems of your partners. And those partners could be your suppliers, could be your manufacturing partners, but are just as important your logistics partners, all the way through to your warehouses and distribution centers. And what we now found out is that in certain cases, companies just use one ERP package, and that one ERP package is leveraged everywhere in their supply chain. Now, ultimately, you still have to deal with logistics providers that ship and deliver your products. So you don't capture everything in your own systems. But in our environment, we use not only a multitude of logistics companies, we also use multiple manufacturing partners in the process. So the ability for us to be able to create that visibility across our wider supply chain is something that was a requirement for us to be able to manage our processes. The universal order visibility is something that's able to track those orders in real time, and this is where the interesting thing comes in. If you're able to collect that data and information, the ability for your machines to be able to understand where those exceptions are in the processes helps to allow you to flag those exceptions and to drive some corrective action through potentially an algorithm you've been able to design yourself. So think about universal orders and the visibility to those universal orders with the ability for the machines in that infrastructure to be able to highlight to the user, hey, you have an exception here, compared to the other way around, where a couple of years ago, our planners were going into the systems, downloading all the data into an Excel file, and going through that, looking for the exceptions to occur. Universal order visibility is more of a platform, and that's some of the development and the progress that we've seen through the years. Ultimately, you look for having that end-to-end visibility, but when you see the benefits of that and how that can drive improvements, you actually start using that as a foundational layer and start connecting everything to that same platform going forwards. Complete different example, hyperlocation. The ability to use the Wi-Fi sensors that we have in a majority of our buildings in a global fashion is something that we can also do to provide a much more accurate location of products and people. So hyperlocation, using a Wi-Fi sensor in a warehouse environment, for example, has helped us to map out exactly how the flows of the picking and the shipping activity occurs within that distribution center. With that information, with that hotspots and ability to see how you're creating some bottlenecks in your supply chain, you can actually become and design a better warehousing facility or a better flow through that warehousing facility based on the information that that hyperlocation provides. Hyperlocation is just as important for products as that it is for people. So with the ability to be able to track the movement of people, and sometimes in Europe that's a little bit limited. In the US, they're a little bit more free to control and manage that aspect of it. But hyperlocation has proven the ability to actually optimize flows. But you could also use that for things like physical inventory. Pervasive video, and pervasive video is an interesting concept because I think video is one of the areas where it's been the most difficult to be able to digitize in the environment or in the ecosystem of partners that we have today. The ability for you to go to a digital data feed and to be able to search in that digital data field for an object or for something that's happened on that video is very new technology. But the ability to do things today that we haven't done in the past. Take the Apple iPhone X has got facial recognition, and facial recognition is something that we use in a variety of areas today in a public sector. But thinking about how you can use that facial recognition in a business environment, I think is something that is definitely new. We have, and that's not in Europe, but that's definitely outside, the ability to flow workers into a production or a warehousing facility and leverage that facial recognition as a secondary security measure to make sure that right people are coming into the right locations within that facility. So security is important here, and I think the security portion of that data is going to be important around, in an outsourced environment, connecting the unconnected and leveraging that data from your ecosystem is something that you need to think through very wisely. How are you going to guarantee that that information stays where it needs to be left? So security has become a very important and critical portion of our supply chain. We have a chief security officer within our supply chain organization responsible for making sure that that security is not only within the physical portion of our security, but also in the cyber portion of our security. How do we connect and make sure that those connections are something that makes sure that our IP gets protected and that we're keeping information for Cisco. So we do that through different kind of mechanisms of conformity and balance and knowledge. Ultimately, it's around audits, physical audits, and making sure that we're doing those audits at all our ecosystem partners. But secondly, we use the data and the information that we get from our ecosystem partners as a methodology, as a capability for us to be able to understand the security of that information. So lastly, I just wanted to close out with some of these benefits of this digitization journey that we've gone through over the last couple of years. And I think that what to me is being important is that when you digitize a process and digitize a supply chain process, it's really important not to basically digitize what you have today, but review what you have today and think about how can I simplify, how can I make sure that I've got a process that's worthy of digitizing? Simplifying that allows you to automate it, allows you to be able to understand how can I make a more systemic input-output process of my activities. And being able to automate that ultimately leads you to the ability to be able to digitize that. Now, digitizing results in a significant amount of data, a significant amount of information that pulls through. And what that next step in the digitization is the ability to be able to orchestrate that. And I think that as a kind of supply chain community, our ability to be able to simplify, automate, and digitize our processes that we have in our supply chain environment, and then be able to use that information, just like 20 years ago, a car was collecting information, but it wasn't resulting in a self-driving car. In a supply chain, the more we're able to capture the data and the information within that supply chain, we can leverage that supply chain for making much more intelligent decisions. So orchestrating to me is the ability in a supply chain to be able to leverage the information that's held there, and for the information that's held there to be able to be transferred into valuable information to make the right decisions. Some of those decisions you can actually go and automate yourself. You can make exception reporting the standard. And sometimes that information is something that you need the right people within the organization to take and come up with a course of correction or course of change. So with the result of what we've been going through for the last 6 years is something that has enabled us over the years to be able to capture more digital information than we've ever captured before. It's allowed us to be able to leverage that digital information in a capability to analyze that. And I think that without the technology of being able to capture it, and without the technology, the computing power to be able to analyze it, we wouldn't be able to leverage that for these number of use cases that we have today. Ultimately, it's about the results, and like I highlighted before, if you can do things smarter and you can do things quicker, ultimately, there's going to be a benefit, and that benefit's going to be either in your costs or in your speed to market. So these numbers are actual numbers based on what we've been able to achieve with these use cases that I highlighted before. And those use cases are things that I think we probably couldn't have been able to think about in the front of the process, early on in the process. However, the more you're being able to drive this as a strategy, the more you're being able to apply this logic within your supply chain, the more opportunities actually are created. Now, Cisco as a company is a company that we are enabling through our networks the ability to be able to connect. And that connection through the infrastructure that we sell allows companies to be able to move data through different kind of nodes. Through the security that Cisco provides in that network layer, it allows us to be able to do that in a way that makes our companies and consumers confident that that information is there for their use. But I think that Cisco as a company is also a company that's been able to leverage what we sell and be able to apply it in our own supply chain. So what I, as leader of a supply chain organization, are asked to do is practice what you preach. Eat your own dog food. Make sure that what you think is going to help to drive business outcomes for your customers. Make sure that you're applying it in your supply chain and showcasing those results. And this was my view of how we've been able to use that technology and that data to our benefit and drive incremental improvements that we wouldn't have been able to achieve if we'd continued on the same path as before. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. We've got time for one, possibly two quick questions. Gentleman over here. There's just a microphone coming, so.
I applaud you for a great presentation, well categorized, and you told me a lot about how to digitize the supply chain and how you've done it at Cisco. This is a global project. The journey was 6 years, and you are responsible for Russia, Europe, and Middle East and Africa. Has it been rolled out in all geographies within Cisco? And were you involved in every single project?
No. We're a supply chain organization of 2,400 people globally, very much outsourced in what we do. A company of $50 billion on a yearly revenue run rate. So what we do on a daily basis, we leverage a lot of our outsourced ecosystem partners. And that means that also in our supply chain organization, we have different functions that are responsible for different activities. I'm responsible for the operations in Europe primarily, which means that these use cases that are implemented in my factories are implemented in my distribution centers or implemented in my transportation routes. I need to be aware of, need to be able to own, and need to be able to drive those productivity savings that I've highlighted there. But we have a supply chain transformation function within our supply chain organization that is accountable for designing and delivering those capabilities.
Thank you.
Gentleman down here.
Hi, my name is Boer Köksal from Netaş, Turkey. Thanks for the excellent presentation. My question is about Cisco has some obligation and responsibility for the services, for after-sales services. So I'm curious about how do you deal with the obsolete components and the products? Is it supply chain organization responsibilities or your tier one suppliers' responsibilities?
So we're, and right or wrong, I think we're a company that seems to be maneuvering between different kind of, or a pendulum that's moving into different kind of ways in which we centralize or decentralize certain functions. The supply chain organization that I'm responsible for is for the forward supply chain, all the way into finished products going into the consumers, but also the returns of those finished products coming back from a stock rotation, for example. We have an after-sales service organization that is separate, and they're also a supply chain organization primarily focused on the spare parts, the inventory of those spare parts, where they're located globally, and the movement of those spare parts. Of course, we work together very closely on these kind of activities, but also on managing of our suppliers, partners, and making sure that we're driving synergies between the two teams. But I work closely with my colleague in Europe, but I'm responsible for the forward supply chain. And the primary focus of this presentation was on that forward supply chain.
Thank you. Time has beaten us. However, Edwin will be around to take any further questions during the breaks. So can we thank Edwin once more?